Welcome to the deep dive. We're tackling a really critical issue today: how to reduce pollution in our drinking water.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got some fascinating research that digs into the economic strategies for, well, making that happen, our
hmm
mission, to pull out the key insights without getting, bogged down in technical jargon so you can really understand what works.
Exactly. And just to set the stage a bit, it's helpful to think about the different ways pollution gets into our water.
Okay.
We often talk about point source pollution. That's like a discharge pipe from a factory. You can literally point at it.
You know where it's coming from.
Right. Then there's diffuse source pollution, which is much more spread out. Think like fertilizer runoff from farms flowing into rivers and lakes.
Ah, okay. So that difference, that's key, right?
Yeah.
Between a single traceable source and something much broader, it must create very different headaches when it comes to figuring out who's polluting
How to stop it? Yeah.
and how to stop it. Exactly.
Precisely. With a factory, you can often measure what's coming out of the pipe.
Hmm.
Relatively straightforward. But with agricultural runoff, it's a mix of factors across a huge area.
Right.
It makes it incredibly challenging to link specific actions to the pollution we actually see in the water.
Got it.
So with that distinction in mind, let's maybe jump into the economic angle on all this
Yeah.
and how it helps us think about solutions for, well, cleaner drinking water.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our research keeps coming back to this idea of pollution as a negative externality. What does that actually mean, for our drinking water?
Okay, so basically it means that when someone pollutes a water source, they're creating a negative impact on others.
Like us drinking the water.
Exactly. People drinking the water, using it for recreation, relying on healthy aquatic ecosystems.
Mhm.
But the polluter often doesn't pay the full cost of that damage. For instance, a company might release chemicals,
Yeah.
right? And those contaminate drinking water supplies downstream. But the company might not fully account for the increased water treatment costs or maybe even health problems down the line.
So because they aren't facing those full costs?
They tend to pollute more than is, let's say, ideal for society as a whole.
Yeah. So it's kind of like they're freeloading on our clean water supply and we end up footing the bill one way or another.
That's a good way to put it. Exactly.
Yeah.
Economics tries to find ways to internalize these externalities. Meaning we want to make polluters face the true costs of their actions. So when we're talking about point source pollution, those identifiable sources impacting our potential drinking water,
Yeah.
the research highlights two main approaches:
Oh, okay.
command and control regulations and market instruments.
Command and control, that sounds like your standard government rules, telling polluters exactly what they can and can't do, right? Like limits.
That's pretty much the gist, yeah.
Yeah.
These are direct regulations, setting specific limits on, say, the amount of a pollutant a factory can release into a river that feeds our drinking water supply,
Or making them install certain tech.
or requiring specific treatment technologies. They're relatively straightforward to understand, maybe easier to implement. That can be a plus, politically speaking.
But I remember the research mentioning some downsides. Something about cost.
Yes. While simple, command and control might not be the most cost-effective way to get cleaner drinking water.
How so?
Well, it treats all polluters the same, right? Regardless of their individual situations, some factories might be able to cut their pollution much more cheaply than others,
Ah, I see.
but they're all held to the same regulatory bar. So this means we might not be getting the biggest bang for our buck in terms of pollution reduction for the overall cost.
Makes sense. So what are these market instruments then? The alternatives for protecting our drinking water sources?
Right, so these are tools that use economic incentives to encourage pollution reduction. The main ones discussed in the research for drinking water protection are taxes on pollutants,
Okay.
subsidies for reducing pollution, and what are called marketable permits.
Let's start with taxes. How does that work?
The core idea here is to put a price on the pollution that could harm drinking water sources. So for every unit of a harmful substance discharged, the polluter pays a tax.
Okay, so this directly tackles that negative externality we talked about, makes them pay for potentially messing up our drinking water.
Exactly.
The research mentions setting a tax equal to the shadow value of pollution. What's that all about, especially for keeping water clean?
Right, the shadow value. It's essentially trying to put a monetary figure on the damage caused by one extra unit of pollution. Damage to our drinking water resources, related ecosystems, all that.
Okay.
Ideally, if the tax is set at this level, it incentivizes polluters to cut back their emissions right up to the point where the cost of reducing more pollution is higher than the tax they'd have to pay.
So it should find the sweet spot.
Theoretically, yes. It leads to the most cost-effective overall reduction in pollution impacting drinking water. Imagine like a polluted river impacting local fishing, which also affects drinking water quality. The shadow value would try to quantify that loss. The reduced fish catch, the economic hit on fishing communities, maybe even lost swimming or boating value.
But that sounds incredibly hard to calculate accurately.
Oh, absolutely. It's really, really difficult to pin down precisely. But it gives you the concept trying to measure that hidden cost.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. The research notes the practical challenges of figuring out that perfect tax rate to really protect our drinking water.
Yeah.
Why is that so tough?
Well, regulators face what economists call information asymmetry.
Reading.
They just don't know as much about each company's pollution control costs as the companies themselves do. It's pretty straightforward. So this creates a situation where, knowing they'll be taxed on what they discharge into potential drinking water sources, companies have a strong incentive to tell regulators that cleaning up is way more expensive than it actually is.
Sneaky? Trying to get a lower tax bill.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Hoping to lower their tax burden.
Okay, the research also mentions a taxes plus standards approach for safeguarding drinking water. How does that work?
Yeah, that's a kind of hybrid approach. It can be really useful for protecting essential resources like drinking water. You set a tax on pollutants, sure, but you also have a baseline standard.
Like a minimum requirement.
Exactly. A minimum level of water quality protection that everyone must meet. This provides a kind of safety net, guaranteeing a certain baseline protection for drinking water sources.
Okay, got it.
While still offering the cost efficiency benefits of a tax for any further reductions beyond that minimum standard.
Now, the research also points out that firms often, they resist taxes aimed at reducing pollution affecting drinking water. Why is that, even if it's theoretically the most cost-efficient way?
It's because they end up paying for the pollution they still emit, even after they've reduced it somewhat.
Oh.
Under a simple standard, they only bear the cost of the cleanup needed to meet that standard. That's it. But with a tax, the actual tax payment on the remaining pollution can sometimes be way higher than the cost of cleaning up that last bit.
So it feels like paying twice, almost.
Kind of. It makes it politically unpopular, even if it might lead to better protection for our drinking water in the long run.
Okay, let's switch gears to subsidies. These are payments to polluters for reducing emissions into water sources, right? Seems like a nice incentive.
It might seem that way on the surface, yeah. But economists generally have some concerns about them, especially for long-term effectiveness and fairness in protecting drinking water.
Like what?
Well, for one, it kind of violates the polluter pays principle, doesn't it? Why should society pay polluters not to contaminate our potential drinking water?
Good point.
And secondly, subsidies can lead to long-term inefficiencies. They might keep less efficient, more polluting firms in business when they might otherwise fail.
Or even encourage polluting industries to grow.
Exactly. They could even encourage the growth of industries that pose a risk to drinking water quality, potentially leading to more pollution overall down the line. It's a bit perverse.
That makes sense. It could create this weird incentive to pollute just so you can get paid to stop. Okay, now what about marketable permits for pollutants threatening drinking water? This sounds more intricate.
It is a bit more complex, yeah, but it combines some of the benefits of both standards and taxes. It can be very effective for controlling pollution affecting drinking water.
How does it work?
So the government sets a cap, a total limit on the amount of a specific pollutant allowed to enter water sources that might be used for drinking water.
Okay, a hard limit.
Yep. And then it issues a corresponding number of permits. These permits can then be bought and sold between the polluters.
Ah, okay. So a company that can easily cut its discharge, maybe it's cheaper for them, they can sell their extra permits.
To a company that finds it much more expensive to clean up.
Exactly.
Okay.
This creates a market for the right to pollute, but only up to that overall cap. Like taxes, it encourages cost-efficient reduction because companies will clean up if it's cheaper than buying a permit.
But unlike a simple tax,
it directly controls the total level of pollution entering our potential drinking water sources because of that fixed cap on permits.
The research mentions the SO2 trading program in the U.S. sulfur dioxide as a big success story for acid rain, which also affects water. What made that work so well? Any lessons there for protecting drinking water?
Yeah, the SO2 program aimed at power plants, it really did lead to significant cost savings compared to old school regulations.
Why?
What made it work was, well, a few things. A clear and steadily declining cap on emissions, that was key. plus robust monitoring and enforcement.
So everyone knew the rules and the goalposts were moving predictably. Exactly. It created a strong, predictable market signal for companies to innovate, to find cheaper ways to cut pollution. That predictability and the declining cap, those are definitely key insights for designing future market systems to safeguard drinking water.
But the research also mentions failures, like the Fox River program. What went wrong there? And why haven't we seen more permit systems specifically for protecting drinking water sources? Seems like a good idea.
Well, the Fox River program, one big issue was a thin market.
Meaning not enough buyers and sellers.
Yeah, there just wasn't enough trading of permits to really drive those cost savings or get the environmental improvements they hoped for. Other reasons for limited adoption for drinking water protection include high transaction costs.
Like the hassle of finding someone to trade with.
Exactly. Finding and negotiating trades. Also, uncertainty about future water quality policies can make companies hesitant. And sometimes, frankly, competing companies just don't want to share information or trade with each other.
What's fascinating here is that the research points out how permit prices can automatically adjust to things like inflation, economic growth, providing this continuous incentive, unlike taxes, which need to be manually updated, right?
That's a really significant advantage, actually. As the economy grows or prices rise, the demand for permits might go up, driving up their price.
Making pollution more expensive automatically.
Right. Which provides a continuous economic push for companies to find cleaner alternatives to protect those drinking water sources. Now, the initial allocation of permits is also a big political thing.
How they're given out in the first place.
Yeah. Grandfathering,
Yeah.
just giving permits away for free based on past emissions, has often been more politically acceptable, easier sell.
And auctioning them off.
Right. Even though auctioning is generally seen as more economically efficient because it makes the polluter bear that initial cost right away. But free allocation can smooth the political path.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot on these economic tools for point sources, the pipes and factories affecting drinking water. Now, let's tackle that trickier issue. Diffuse source pollution, like agricultural runoff, nitrates getting into groundwater we might later drink. The research really hammers home how hard it is to monitor individual sources here.
Absolutely. It's the core problem. Unlike a discharge pipe, it's incredibly hard, sometimes impossible, to pinpoint exactly which farm or even which field is contributing what amount of pollutant to a drinking water aquifer.
So many variables.
Rainfall, soil type, groundwater flow patterns,
Wow.
all these complex environmental factors play a huge role. It makes it really difficult to directly link, say, a specific farming practice to the level of nitrates we find in our drinking water wells months or years later.
And there are time lags too, right?
Huge time lag sometimes. For example, the research mentioned nitrate pollution we detect in UK groundwater today might actually be the result of fertilizer use decades ago.
Wow. So if we can't easily monitor emissions from these diffuse sources impacting drinking water, how can we even begin to control them using economic?
It forces us towards indirect methods. The research discusses several. One is input regulation.
Like taxing fertilizers.
Exactly. Taxing fertilizers used in agriculture.
Sure.
The theory is if you make these polluting inputs more expensive, farmers will, hopefully use less of them.
And less ends up in the water.
Thus reducing the amount of nitrates and other contaminants that could leach into drinking water sources. Ideally, an input tax could be as cost-efficient as a direct emissions tax.
Big brain.
It requires a really, really good understanding of what's called the non-point production function.
It means.
Basically, how different levels of input use fertilizer, water, whatever, on various types of land translate into the actual amount of pollution reaching drinking water sources.
And that's likely to vary wildly from farm to farm, right? Based on soil, slope,
Yeah.
everything.
Totally. Which makes designing differentiated input taxes, charging different rates based on risk, incredibly complex to implement fairly and effectively to protect drinking water.
You could have farmers just selling fertilizer to each other to get around it.
Precisely. Practical issues like that could undermine the whole thing.
Okay, another approach mentioned is regulating management practices, like a code of good agricultural practice, encouraging farmers to adopt methods that reduce runoff into drinking water sources. These seem popular politically.
They often are, yeah. Because they usually involve guidance, recommendations, maybe voluntary measures, rather than direct financial penalties that can be less confrontational for the agricultural sector.
But the research suggests they might not always be that effective for actually safeguarding our water supply.
Their effectiveness really depends, heavily, on whether farmers have sufficient incentive to consistently adopt these practices, especially if they cost time or money, and also whether we really understand the cause and effect link between those specific practices and actual pollution reductions reaching our drinking water. Sometimes the science isn't quite there yet.
Okay. Now, this ambient tax idea sounds interesting. Taxing based on the overall pollution level in a water body, like a lake or river serving as a drinking water source. How does that work for diffuse sources?
It's a collective responsibility approach. The idea is to make all potential polluters in that watershed, all the farms, maybe even septic systems in the area, collectively responsible for the quality of their shared drinking water resource.
So if the water gets too polluted.
Everyone in the contributing area pays a tax, maybe based on acreage or some other proxy.
Incentive for the community to clean up.
Theoretically, yes. It creates an incentive for the communities as a whole, maybe through peer pressure or local initiatives, to adopt cleaner practices. Yeah. But it definitely raises fairness questions.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
A farmer who's already invested heavily in protecting drinking water might still have to pay because of their neighbors' actions. And they have very limited individual control over whether they pay the tax or not.
Tricky. The research also touches on these more complex dual instruments, combining emission taxes and ambient taxes, and incentive schemes based on polluter attributes. Sounds pretty sophisticated.
They are definitely attempts to get more nuanced, to overcome the limitations of simpler approaches when you're dealing with the messiness of diffuse pollution and trying to protect drinking water.
How so?
Well, dual instruments try to, say, tax the observable aspects of pollution directly where possible, maybe certain land management choices, and then use an ambient tax to cover the unobservable stuff.
And the incentive schemes.
Those try to reward farmers who adopt practices known to be effective in reducing risks to drinking water based on their farm's characteristics, even if we can't measure their individual impact perfectly. Sort of paying for good behavior based on known risk factors.
And then there's the idea of land use permits, like the Cambridgeshire example mentioned, where permits are based on the type of land use as a proxy for its potential to leach pollutants into drinking water.
Precisely. Different land uses, say, intensive row crops versus pasture versus forest, carry very different risks of contributing pollutants like nitrates or pesticides to drinking water.
So restricting or permitting certain uses.
Yeah, requiring permits based on land use can be a way to manage those diffuse pollution risks across the landscape. But you also have to consider the intensity of that use. How heavily is it being farmed? A pasture isn't necessarily low risk if it's overgrazed right next to a stream.
Right.
And there's always a risk of creating weird unintended consequences depending on how those initial permits are allocated.
Okay, finally, the research discusses trading between point and diffuse sources. For pollution that affects drinking water, seems logical, right? A factory could pay farmers to reduce their runoff instead of installing super expensive tech at their own plant.
It sounds good in theory.
But it hasn't been very successful in practice for protecting water supplies. Why not?
You're right. Implementing these traits effectively for drinking water protection has proven really challenging. In the cases mentioned, like Dillon Reservoir or Tar Pamlico, point sources, the factories, often just found it cheaper and more straightforward to upgrade their own treatment facilities. Dealing with the complexities of negotiating, verifying pollution reductions from potentially hundreds of farms. It's a lot.
Plus other issues.
Yeah, things like non-uniform mixing pollution from one farm might impact the drinking water intake much more directly than pollution from other farms further away. And you need really robust regulatory oversight to make sure the trades are real and actually benefit water quality. It adds layers of complexity.
Wow. Okay. So after this really deep dive into the economic toolbox, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? People concerned about reducing pollution in their drinking water.
Well, I think the first thing is there's clearly no single magic bullet solution, no one-size-fits-all answer. The best approach to protecting our drinking water depends so heavily on the specific context. Are you dealing with a factory pipe or widespread farm runoff? How easy is it to actually monitor the pollution? What are the costs of different options? And frankly, what's politically feasible?
Yeah, it sounds like there's this constant balancing act between how cost-efficient a solution is for the polluter and how certain we can be that it will actually lead to cleaner, safer drinking water for everyone.
Exactly that trade-off.
Yeah.
Market-based instruments, taxes, permits they offer potential cost savings for reducing pollution affecting drinking water. But, as we saw, implementing them can be complex, face political hurdles.
And the diffuse stuff is just hard.
And tackling diffuse source pollution, which is a major threat to many drinking water supplies globally, remains a huge challenge. It often requires these innovative, sometimes indirect approaches, precisely because monitoring individual contributions is so difficult.
And it really underscores the need for ongoing collaboration,
Yeah.
right? Between the scientists figuring out the pollution pathways and the economists designing the tools. Absolutely crucial. We need the scientific understanding, how pollutants travel, how they impact water quality to inform the economic models, and help design policies that will actually work to protect our drinking water resources effectively and sustainably.
Okay, so to kind of wrap it up, economic approaches try to make polluters face the real costs of potentially harming our drinking water. We've got this whole range of tools,
Direct rules, taxes, subsidies, permits.
each with its own pros and cons, especially when we grapple with those really complex, diffuse sources,
Yeah.
like agriculture.
Yeah. And maybe this leads us to a final thought for you, the listener. Given these inherent difficulties, especially with diffuse pollution, how should we as societies balance the economic costs of regulation, which are real, with the absolute fundamental, non-negotiable need for clean and safe drinking water for every single person?
That's a big question.
It really is. It's a question with many different viewpoints and some incredibly tough trade-offs to consider. There aren't easy answers. Definitely something to think about long after this deep dive. If this discussion has piqued your interest in this vital issue of protecting our drinking water, we definitely encourage you to explore some of these areas further.
Yeah, you could look into the history of that SO2 trading program, see what lessons really apply to water.
Or look into the efforts to manage agricultural runoff right in your own region, see what they're trying.
Or even dig into some of those newer economic ideas like ambient taxation for diffuse sources. It's a constantly evolving field.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us on the deep dive.